We have two very special guests today, Alicia Williams and Miss June Brown. They're going to be discussing transgender and gender non-conforming and intersex populations in prison. So I'll introduce both panelists briefly. Alicia Williams is the director of the Prisoner Justice Project at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, where she represents transgender prisoners through legal service provision, impact litigation, policy advocacy, and public education. Alicia's work with the Prisoner Justice Project and SRLP's Prisoner Advisory Committee seeks to further an abolitionist dialogue that centralizes the voices of incarcerated trans, gender non-conforming, and intersex community members. She is currently in the process of filing a class action lawsuit against the New York Department of Corrections and Community Supervision on behalf of transgender women in prison who are being denied necessary health care. After graduating from Cardozo Law School, Alicia moved to Philadelphia, where she was an active member of the Books Through Bars Collective. In addition to her prison organizing work in Philadelphia, she worked at a small plaintiffs litigation firm, practiced disability law, and clerked for the Honorable Judge Quinones. Ms. June Brown is a self-identified Black transgender woman. She is also a performer and longtime activist who is continually advocating for the rights of various underserved and marginalized communities. She began her activist career as an original founding member of fabulous, independent, educated radicals for community empowerment. In her hometown, in her hometown of the Lower East Side of Manhattan. In the past, she has also been involved with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project as a staff member in the Media, Public Speaking, Education Department of the organization. She has also helped the organization finalize its strategic plan. Other organizations that she has been involved with have been the Neutral Zone, Heights Hill Mental Health Services, and the Audre Lorde Office Trans Justice Group. While still in undergraduate school, she developed a media campaign that targeted young transgender women of color for the Gay Men's Health crisis. In 2007, she was part of the television history when she became one of the first transgender people to be featured on All My Children in a completely unscripted segment. She is currently still an activist for the causes she believes in, as well as an inspiring musical artist and nightclub socialite entrepreneur. She truly is every woman. Without further ado, thank you to both of you.
I'm trying to set this up so you don't actually have to hold the mic. Can everyone hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you for the introduction, Paul, and we are definitely delighted to be here. We are going to talk about prison conditions for trans people in New York State and generally, but we are also going to do basically a general overview of how trans people are pushed into the prison system. So we're going to start today just by talking about some of the stigma that pushes people out onto the streets and forces people into alternative economies, and then eventually ends up in them being in prison. And then I'll talk about some of the work that SRLP does to advocate for trans people in prison and basically offer some sort of solutions or strategies so that we can all fight for abolition. And we certainly like to have it more interactive, but because we're trying to cover a lot in 1 hour, we're going to try to just save 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions while we're talking, just go ahead and scroll them down and we'll make sure we have time for you to speak at the end.
Thank you, Alicia. The microphone is actually kind of for me because I am getting over a cold. So I hope that you guys, you can hear me, I'm sure, right? I try to push out. So I'm going to kind of go over the first 3 things, or the major 3 things that lead trans people into a sort of, well, part of what we were going to give you for the handout, the flow chart that occurs. It's a trifecta, right? And the first issue, the first thing that I would say affects how trans people are perceived, whether that be trans youth or trans adults, would be media. These are things pretty much that I would say put trans people in a negative light. create stigmas that are really belittling and demeaning to trans people. So, like I said before, media. Now, I'm sure you've all seen television shows where trans people aren't necessarily portrayed as like the most effeminate trans people in the world, like, you know, trans women. Take for instance Gun Hill Road. Have either one of y'all seen that film? Yeah, I see one person shaking their head. Everybody else is looking at me like I have two heads. Okay, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Well, in that film, one of the major character, Harmony, I know her like personally, she actually does not look like that in real life. For whatever reason, like they butched her up a whole lot in that film in order for people to understand that she was transgender. So what's really interesting to me is the need to make trans women as unbelievably feminine or female as possible. It's I think really specific to trans women and not so much to trans men. And that can be tied into misogyny and ideologies that, like, you know, if a male-bodied person or if a masculine person chooses, and I use chooses in quotation marks, I say that in quotation marks because we, of course, don't choose to be feminine or female or women, but chooses to, I would say, let go of masculine or male privilege, then there's something really wrong with that. So from there, did folks get that? Like in the media, like there are folks who are portrayed as unbelievable. Let me put this back a little bit. And then the ones who are feminine enough, the ones who are quote unquote believable as passing for women or being women, even though we are women, those trans women who are portrayed in the media are seen as tricksters or women who are doing this in order to get over on people. Like, you know, the famed Jerry Springer show, who we all like, you know, love and know as, you know, quality television. You know, where people are encouraged to fight trans women who come out as trans, who are actually passively, quote unquote, I hate the term passable, to me it evokes like, you know, thoughts of black folks who were passing as white, you know, in early days. I'm not sure if y'all know about that. But it just has so many negative connotations, that term passable. But yeah, like trans women who are fitting in their gender identity are then encouraged to be beat up because then they're divulging, oh, you know, by the way, I am transgender. And not transgender, but I'm a man. That's the term that's used. So it's, in media, there is no in-between. There are no, like, trans women who are portrayed in a positive light. Even trans women who are actual actresses, like Laverne Cox, folks who are very serious to their craft, had at one point in their careers had to settle for less than stellar roles, like roles where they are to portray, like, you know, street prostitutes or tricksters, like trans women who aren't going to divulge their trans identity, and they shouldn't have to in reality. But, you know, in the media, there's just like these really negative portrayals of trans women. And this is reinforced by the health system, right? This is the second part of the trifecta, the health system. I'm not certain if you all know, I'm guessing you do, because I know one person in this audience who does, know about the DSM-4 and 5, and GID, the gender identity disorder, which is a quote-unquote legitimate mental disorder that pretty much states that trans people are sick for being transgender. Like, it is an illness. And, you know, there are a lot of folks in the trans community who need to have this diagnosis in order to receive services, right? In order to get things like gender reassignment surgeries or other things, folks do feel as if they need to have this. But then with that comes, of course, like, you know, another negative connotation, more stigma. You know, if somebody tells you, oh, you know, you're sick, and so this is why you need to go and you need to get these kinds of treatments. This is why you need to get this. It's not to affirm who you are as a person, but it's to help your sickness. Then that becomes internalized, and that makes a person really believe that there's something wrong with them. And whether it is known, like it's at the forefront of their mind, they realize that this is something that is going to affect them negatively, or whether it's subliminal, it's still the case. Like, you're telling somebody that they're sick, and it's, you know, it's bad, not just for the person who you're telling them, you know, not just for the community, but to the larger community as a whole. You know what I'm saying? Like the non-trans people, folks who are onlookers, people who are like family members of a trans person. It affects everyone. Okay, I'm good. Okay, because I really want to get into this. So then the third thing would be religion. That this reinforces. So we have the media, right? The media with its points about what trans people are, either those trans folks who are not believably passable as their gender identity or gender expression would allow them to be, trans people who, I guess, do not fit that ideal, and those who do fit it and are thought of as being tricksters or or dishonest. So, you know, you have that, and then you have the health folks who are pathologizing trans people, folks who, like in the DSM, folks who say that trans people are sick. So then this is all reinforced through religion, of course. The third piece is trifecta, the Bible. And, you know, even though there aren't any real pieces in the Bible, there aren't real like scriptures that speak specifically to trans people, people still conflate homosexuality and transgenderism as one, gender expression, and you know, homosexuality as one specific thing. And even though this has been said constantly, like, you know, people choose to believe in what they want to believe in, you know, folks who have no other argument will always say, it says so in the Bible. You know, whether they neglect to look at all the other things that are said in the Bible, like, you know, you can't be shellfish or you can't commit adultery, like, you know, it's very, people seem to become very specific about what they think is right and wrong. So I'm not saying that whether it says in the Bible or not, like homosexuality is wrong or not, like this is not an issue of, oh, well, you know, they're not talking about us, so sorry for you gay people. Like it's still an issue that people are choosing to decide what they think is right and what they think is wrong. And as a whole, that's just wrong. Like if you're gonna take things at face value like that, then you have to take the entire thing. Like you have to take everything into account. So, with all this enforced, with all these three things enforced, trans people are then subjected to really horrific treatment at home, right? Because it starts at home. That's like the base. That's where people receive their foundation. So when like their parents or parent realizes that, oh, you know, the Bible says that you are a deviant, you know, you're dressing in women's clothing or you're dressing in men's clothing, and you're doing things with men or women that the Bible says is wrong, and that, you know, they say on Jerry Springer is wrong, and that, you know, at the hospital they say you're sick, then, you know, you can't live here. You can't be in this house. It's my rules. It's my way or the highway. And so, you know, oftentimes trans folks are let go of. They're told by parents, by parental units, by guardians that, you know, their display of behavior is sick and wrong. And there seems to be a lack of understanding at the foundation at home. So then from there, they are, you know, a lot of trans folks have issues at school. Like it's a combination, right? Like you have home issues. You have your parents and family telling you that they don't understand who you are. And so you go to school, and then there are other students who may or may not get you, may or may not receive you well. And with these two things in play, there's just a lot of, I would say, emotional and traumatic experiences. You don't have the foundation at home to deal with school and bullying and harassment at school, then it can all become like a slippery slope. For many people who experience issues at home, there is homelessness, like a lot of trans youth, specifically LGBT youth, but trans young people. I don't have the exact like numbers or percentage, but from my time at Fierce, I remember that the percentage of homeless LGBT youth were just as, if not higher, than a lot of other youth. Because upon coming out, they were just told, no, like you cannot be in this home. And it was traumatizing to them. It was also backed up by their, you know, this trifecta, the media, the health, the religion, this thinking that, you know, I am justified for telling you to leave this home because these people say that it's the way to be. Either you will be in this box, or you will leave this house. So from there, young people either enter the foster care system or the shelter system. And you know, that within itself is it's a completely different animal for a lot of young people to experience that. Yeah. All right.
So thank you, June. June did a great job of just explaining how stigma is created in society and how it is so strong and pervasive that it gets into your families, so much so that they're going to push you out of the streets. They're going to try to treat you, or they're going to push you out. And again, you start losing your support systems, not just in the home, but at school. And oftentimes people are just pushed into these very gender segregated systems. Foster care system, school, the shelter system, those are all very gender segregated in that if you were assigned a male sex at birth but you identify as a female, they're still going to put you in a male facility. And in that male facility, you're going to confine to male gender norms. If you don't want to cut off your hair, if you don't want to wear jeans or whatever the uniform is, if you want to wear jewelry and other accessories that affirm your gender identity, then you're going to be punished. And in that way, a lot of young people, and as they move into the adult system, they end up having these records, these very thick records that make them look like they are discipline problems. They have all these behavioral issues when all they're trying to do is express their gender identity. So again, like that is just kind of like a very brief overview, and probably move kind of quickly, but I saw a lot of nodding heads, so I feel like I'll get some of the basics. And I hope you all had a chance to pick up not only the diagram that was handed out, I saw that in the chairs, but also the packet that says Transgender Injustice, Police Encounters, and Incarceration on it. And we're not going to go through all of that during this session, but there are a lot of stories in there that kind of, it's one thing to see it all on a chart and have us say it really quickly to you, but actually the stories collected by our Prisoner Advisory Committee, which I'll explain in a minute, they go very deeply into explaining, again, the stigma and what happens once you're forced into these gender segregated facilities. There's one in particular that I wanted to share from Ms. Cynthia China Blast. I'm not going to read the entire thing to you, but she does explain how back as early back as her 11th birthday, she had to run away from her home because her stepfather was beating her with 2x4s and basically telling her, be a man and stop acting like a faggot. And then once she was pushed out of her home and had to go into the foster care system, she found that she couldn't comply with the gender norms, so she found herself on the streets. And she makes a very powerful statement about how when she was on the streets presenting as a young boy and she was engaging in sex work, she could walk by police officers, like loads of police officers, and they wouldn't do anything. They weren't paying her any attention. But as soon as she started to present as a female, then they saw her as a problem, and she was dragged into prison and locked up on numerous occasions. And she also does a very good job of explaining what happens once a trans person encounters the police. We've had several reports of people saying, you know, I was unnecessarily strip searched, and it wasn't done in a private setting. I was made to stand in front of several officers and lined up. I was chained to a bench for hours on end, and this is all before anyone even gets before a judge. And sometimes the charges are just dropped and dismissed. It's really just about taking the person off the street and humiliating them. So again, Cynthia China Blast, she does a really good job in her statement, but all of our PAC members did. So when I say PAC members, it's SRLP's Prisoner Advisory Committee, which is right now made up of about between 70 and 80 trans people who are incarcerated, trans people, gender non-conforming, intersex, and their allies. And one of the things that we try to do in our work, when we're doing these panels, we're setting our priorities as far as policies and litigation, is we reach out to our Prisoner Advisory Committee, because the people who are incarcerated are the people who experience the violence and the marginalization most. So that's kind of how we set up our work. So one of the things that we're working on right now, as Paul mentioned in my brief bio, talking about the litigation that we are preparing for, basically to make sure that the trans women in New York State facilities are getting the health care that they need. Just to give like a very brief overview of that litigation, before 2008, the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, that's DOCS, they had a policy that said if you were not receiving hormones prior to incarceration, then we're not going to give you any hormones in the prison. It's not our responsibility to start you on that stuff. It's unnecessary. And as we explained before, a lot of people who end up in the prison system were living on the streets beforehand, or were living in a community of people where they supported each other by passing around drugs. So people who were taking hormones, they weren't necessarily prescribed. So they would go into the prison system and not have a prescription, so the prison was just saying, no, we're not going to give you anything. So that withdrawal of hormones caused people a lot of physical and emotional harm. So we did a lot of negotiations with docs at the time, and they changed their policy in 2008. It's not the policy that we're advocating for. It's very vague, but it does say that if you were not receiving hormones prior to incarceration, if you exhibit symptoms of GID, then we will send you out to a consultant and get you a diagnosis. That sounds all well and good on paper. That's not actually what they're doing. We still have a number of physicians at the various facilities who are denying people medical treatment and still quoting the pre-2008 policy. We have people in the Prisoner Advisory Committee who have sent us in the responses that they received from docs once they asked for hormones. And those responses were sometimes like flat out lies. They were handed like a 1999 policy that we know is not the one that is in effect right now. So again, like we're making some progress with docs, but not enough. So that's why we are here enough to sue them. Hopefully that's not really the route that we have to go, because litigation, like people think that lawyers are all about litigation, but we're about finding the quickest remedy for people that we are serving. And litigation is not a quick process. So we really like to just scare them and push them into doing the right thing. So anyway, that's just a brief overview of the litigation that we are about to engage in. But I also want to touch on some of the other things that we work with people who are in prison on. One of the things that June was talking about earlier, which she was talking about the media, people don't even realize that, you know, a lot of sitcoms and things, they don't have trans characters. They barely even have the gender non-conforming characters. But they'll easily slip in a trans joke here and there that people find themselves laughing at and not really thinking about. And beyond that, prisons are often laughed at on shows, and people aren't really taking time to think about the jokes. One that everyone has heard, I'm sure, is like, don't drop the soap when you go to prison. And people, you know, like, that's funny, you're going to get raped in prison. And, you know, I do this job, I read these letters every day. It's not fun. So a lot of people take it for granted, like they think it's funny, like, oh yeah, if you go into prison, you're going to get assaulted. And that's even more so for trans people who are incarcerated, gender nonconforming, and intersex people who are incarcerated. I just read a letter this week, I didn't get my cluster thinking about it already, from a young trans woman that was recently incarcerated. And she said as soon as she was taken in, the guards made her drop to the ground and do push-ups. They're just like, act like a man, do push-ups. And she did push-ups until she dropped and couldn't do them anymore. And then they continued, they put their foot on her head and then tried to stick it in her rectum and just taunted her, saying, I bet you like that, act like a man. So that's like one example of a story that I read like every week. And it's obviously not funny. So it's something that we work on as far as trying to make sure that people are have safer placements in prison. A lot of people think that the people perpetrating the assaults are other people who are incarcerated, because we're trained to think that everyone in prison is bad. When, if you think about everything again that June and I said in the beginning, it's like, it's not that you are bad, it's that our lives are policed and our lives are criminalized, so we're tossed into prison for expressing our own identities. So anyway, the majority of the assaults that I hear about are not perpetrated by the bad people in prison, they're perpetrated by correctional officers. And one of the things that Cynthia touches on in her story, she talks about her experiences with police officers and corrections officers, and she's like, you know, she basically was living in a low-income neighborhood as a person of color who was seen as someone who was taking jobs away from the Irish Catholic community that was already in a low-income neighborhood. So these are the people who are the police officers. These are the same people who are working in the prisons. So they were basically taking out their beliefs on someone else, someone they saw as a freak. I think she says in her writing, they saw me as an abomination to God, and they called me that. Again, the correctional officers are our main perpetrators of a sexual assault. So one of our main concerns is the placement of trans people in prison. Some facilities right now have a policy that if you are trans or gender nonconforming or intersex, as soon as you enter the prison system, they're going to put you in protective custody because they're concerned about your safety, or they say that they're concerned about the disruption that you may cause in the general population. So what that means is if you are put into, a lot of people hear about the lawsuits about solitary confinement now, like saying that's not an appropriate punitive measure, you shouldn't be in solitary confinement for more than like 25 days because of the psychological effects of being in total isolation in these very tiny cells. But people don't really include with that argument what happens to people who are put in protective custody. So protective custody is the same thing as solitary confinement, except that it's not punitive. It's supposed to be for your protection, but you're still locked down for 23 hours a day. When you're in protective custody, you're not allowed to participate in programs. So I don't think it's in Cynthia's story. Cynthia has contributed a lot, that's why I share her story most often, but she has included some of her stories for us in the past, like She's been in prison since 1997, I believe, and she's been in solitary confinement for over 9 years at the various facilities that she's been transferred to. But again, I'm sorry, protective custody. So she is saying, you know, I know that I am not up for parole until like 2018, but at the same time, I'm going to go before the parole board for the first time and say that I've been in prison for over a decade and I haven't engaged in any programs. The only thing I was able to get was my GED. And a lot of times what the parole board is looking at is, what was your behavior like when you were in prison? What programs did you participate in? Like, have you engaged in programming that developed you as a person? And she's just saying, I haven't been given that chance. And she's right, she hadn't been given that chance. And one of the hardest things is that when we have been working with docs to say, you know, she needs to be in the general population. One of the most recent letters that we received was a letter from docs that said, because she's been in isolation for so long, we don't know how she's going to react around other people, so we can't place her in the general population. So because of what they've done to her for over almost a decade now, they are afraid to put her in the general population. So it's just something that we try to get incorporated into the more mainstream, like, and solitary confinement arguments. It's also in protective custody, because they're not protecting the person. They're not making any positive changes in their lives while they're in prison. And particularly, again, for trans people, because what that has meant for Cynthia is that the only people she's interacted with are people who are correctional officers, who don't always like her. She's been assaulted on numerous occasions over the past 10 years by correctional officers. She was given to another inmate, another person who's incarcerated, by a guard. He was saying, if you want protection, I can protect you, but you're going to need to do what I ask you to do. And she had to engage in sexual behavior with the correctional officer and this other person who was incarcerated. And another thing that has happened is she has, when she's going out to take a shower, she has to have an escort so she can have a private shower access. And when she's leaving her cell, she has to walk by other cells and people are yelling at her, calling her a faggot, or catcalling at her, and just basically sexualizing her identity. And what happens when that's the only interaction you have with people, she has had some outbursts where she yells back at the person. But just as on the streets, when trans people might be victim of intimate partner violence, when the police are called on the outside, if they find out that person is trans or see them and they say that you're gender nonconforming, they usually, again, sexualize that person's identity, or they go and say that you were trying to be deceitful or it must have been you. The same thing happens in prison. So Cynthia has a number of misbehavior or disciplinary incidents written up on her record because of the catcalling that she's been subjected to, being called a faggot, people throwing things at her. If she does anything back, it's written up on her disciplinary record. And just uses further justification for keeping her in solitary confinement. Or, yeah, protective custody, sorry. Yeah, same difference, exactly. So again, like placement and safety is one of the things that are two of the issues that come up the most in our work. And what we can do is we write letters to the superintendents. We let the corrections officers know that that person has people on the outside who's looking out for them. And sometimes that just means we can do 3 advocacy letters, 2 phone calls, and then that's sort of the end of our work. I was very happy. Recently, we got Cynthia transferred to a different facility because she had been assaulted in January by a couple of correctional officers. And it was really exciting to know that she had been moved to a new place, and she wrote me a letter, and she's like, I am still in protective custody, and she's like such a letdown. But she did write a letter. She was just like, you know what, I feel safe, so thank you for making that transfer for me. Because like, she honestly believes that she just would have been assaulted again. And one of the most touching things, like when she wrote that letter, she had included pictures of her injuries, and it was like a very thick packet, like 9 pages of stuff, so it was just like tear-jerking stuff. And then I get to the end, and she'd written a poem, and she's like, please share this with the other prisoner advisory committee members, because I want them to know that they are not alone. Which is like, it's pretty powerful stuff. One of the most amazing parts of my work at SRLP is working with the prisoner advisory committee. Because as we all know, prisons are people who are moving for, pushing for reform in prisons I don't really think reform is the way to go, because we know that prisons are working just fine. They're doing what they're meant to do. They're taking people away from their families. You know, the closest facilities are the jails, like at Rikers. People on public transportation to go there, but once your loved one is convicted of a crime, then they're sent away to these prisons that are not accessible, which also makes my life difficult, because I have a lot of nice places that I would love to visit, but they're out in Auburn, and all parts of New York that I've never even heard of. But again, one of my favorite parts of the work is working with the Prisoner Advisory Committee, because that way we are able to share their stories. We put together a publication once a year called In Solidarity, and it includes artwork, poetry, other written submissions, and we compile all that stuff in the newsletter and distribute it to all the Prisoner Advisory Committee members, and they are all extremely excited and thankful when they see that their work is included, or even if they didn't submit anything, they're just reading that other people are going through the same things that they are going through. It's one way. It seems small when we think about it sometimes, but when reading the letters, we know that it has a major impact, but it's one way that we are fighting the prison industrial complex to make sure that people are not totally isolated. So it's not just about performing our legal work, but it's also about doing the different movement building to make sure that people have these sort of connections and resources while they're on the inside. I can talk a little bit more about prison conditions. I know we still have a decent amount of time, but I do wanted to see if we have any questions so far.
I just have two questions. The first is, what could interested parties do as far as like involvement in all these issues, which you've both narrated very well. And then the second one is, can you discuss, like, in general or in any way, the implications of closing the LGBT unit, so to speak, at Rikers?
First, I'll start with your last question, the second question. Are people familiar with the LGBT housing that they had at Rikers? So it's something that the city's actually gone back and forth on. I don't have the exact dates, but there used to be LGBT housing there used to be LGBT housing at Rikers. They took it away, I don't know how long ago. They did close.
2005 or 2006.
Between 2005 and 2007, according to my Thank you. So it was shut down, and the Department of Corrections, which is the entity that governs the city jails, they actually reached out to SRLP and some other organizations, and they said that they're trying to implement the LGBT housing again. So it's a difficult issue for us, because as an organization who considers ourselves abolitionists again, we never really want to advocate for special housing, LGBT housing. It's the same thing as saying we're going to build another prison, because that just means they're pumping more money into this prison industrial complex, and they're going to just make sure that they fill those prisons up because they make more money when it's full. So in theory, we don't want to advocate for special LGBT housing. However, like I said, we work with our Prisoner Advisory Committee, because those, again, are the people who are most affected by the violence, and it's one thing for us to sit on the outside and say, no, don't build that special housing, but we, even though as an organization we are still pushing for those abolitionist perspectives, we have to deal with the fact that we have trans people, LGBT people who are incarcerated right now, and their safety is our biggest concern. So again, we reached out to our Prisoner Advisory Committee, and I'm pretty sure it was 100% of the people responded when they said we want LGBT housing, we would feel safer with the LGBT housing. So even though that's not necessarily aligned with our mission, like that's what we are going to advocate for. So it's something that may actually pop up again, LGBT housing at Rikers. Your other question was
involvement.
How do you get involved? So generally at SRLP we have a membership structure. If you would like to come volunteer, we have a new volunteer orientation April 18th, which is next Thursday, I believe. We are going to have an orientation from 6 to 7, and then a film screening of our film toilet training that has been used by universities, government agencies, various different organizations to just talk about the advantages of not having gender segregated bathrooms. So you'll have a chance to possibly engage in the membership training from 6 to 7. If you want to come for the film screening at 7, that would be great, because we're also looking for new people who have not seen that film before, because it is now almost 10 years old, I think. And we're trying to revamp it. It still has like old Law and Order chimes and references to Ally McBeal. So we're trying to so it'd be great if any of y'all could come to that screening. Our address, I believe, is in this publication. 147 West 24th Street. You can also just look it up online. And that's just generally how you could get involved with SRLP. But on the broader issues, one of the main things, again, like I said earlier, that we push with our work is making sure that people who are incarcerated feel connected to the outside community. So we also have actually, included in this packet, the Transgender and Justice packet, we have some instructions at the end. It starts with the bottom of page 8. It says, now what? Like, now what? After we hear these horrific stories, what can we do? So we have some pen pal tips and guidelines, because it's really, really powerful. Again, just communication, letter writing, just letting people know that you care. There are different pen pal programs out there that you can get involved with. We have a short list in this publication. And you can also, again, like ask SRLP if you'd like to become a pen pal member with one of our prison advisory committee members. And we are also in the process of putting together a prison visit guide. It may sound scary, and it kind of is, but if you'd like to go to Rikers one day and just visit someone, like, it means the world to people. Even if it's not something that you can do on an ongoing basis, or something you can do one day, it would make an incredible impact on people's lives. But it's also a very serious endeavor. That's why we're taking the steps to put together this prison visit guide, because we've had attorneys, interns, volunteers, and just friends go visit prisons before. These are allies and also transgender, non-conforming, and intersex folks. And they've had a little bit of taste of what our clients face as far as the correctional officers harassing them. We had one trans woman who was a volunteer who was just on her own going to visit some trans people that she knew at Rikers, and she was subjected to a strip search on 2 different occasions. And she is amazing, because she was like, I'm going to go back, I expected that, and that's fine. And I was like, okay. But actually one of the toughest parts for her was actually when she sat down to meet with this person. Again, like, prisons are breeding places for violence and drugs. So if you go in there and you committed a non-violent offense or whatever, you're entering a very violent environment. So anyway, the person that our volunteer was meeting with started telling her about her experiences with drugs in prison and with the violence that she witnessed. And that was hard. That was what the person was going through did not expect. So again, our guide took a lot of input from her experiences and others to just talk about self-care. Like, how could you prepare yourself mentally for a visit, and make sure you think through all of these things before you get someone's hopes up and you say, I'm going to come visit you. Or like, oh, I have off every Friday, so I'll come every Friday. Like, think about it, make sure you're taking care of yourself in the process, because that is the only way that you're actually going to be able to make an impact, if you're taking care of yourself and doing that. So letter writing, visits, also coming to panels like this and sharing the stories that you read in these packets, taking it to your classes, to your jobs. Yeah, sharing stories. A lot of people, I think, sometimes like come to panels and expect us to talk about our litigation and like spend the entire time talking about legal work, but what I really want to do is share stories with the people that we work with.
You got a question?
Yeah. So you were saying that that the LGBT housing is not your most preferred way of dealing with the issue. So what would you propose as your perfect solution, quote unquote, for this issue?
One of the things that there's no like
Yeah, abolition, like really. Yeah.
People, yeah, a lot of people, I went and I spoke to a college class before, and I was talking about abolition, and this one woman was sitting in the back of her arms folded, just looking at me really busy. And I thought by the end of me talking talking, she would like, you know, relax a little bit, but she was still looking at me like just piercing through me. And it turns out she had a family member who was a victim of violence, and she was like, that person who committed that crime deserves to be in prison. I mean, it's difficult to talk to people who are in these spaces where they haven't healed from that violence yet. But it's also necessary to point out that you have not healed from that violence. Putting that person in prison did not give you the justice that you felt you needed. So it's really about taking the time to have serious discussions about transformative justice and thinking about community-based solutions when there is violence in our communities. What is the most effective way to deal with it in our communities? It may not be like a nationwide solution. It's something that we need to think about in our smaller communities, because we are the ones most equipped to think about healing what is going to bring our community back together.
Something that I wanted to highlight really that was said earlier is that, can y'all hear me by the way?
Yeah.
I'm still self-conscious. and I hate speaking to people. I love speaking with people. One of the, that wasn't shade, Alicia, that was not shade to you. So yeah, like one of the things that I wanted to highlight was just how we had said before, I'm not sure if I said it or Alicia said it, that the prison industrial complex like actually is doing what it was meant to do, right? Like it's not meant to rehabilitate people. It's not meant to make people better so they can come back into society and be contributing, like, you know, society members. Like that's BS, like that doesn't happen. It actually hardens people, it makes people hardened criminals. And so when they go back or they come back into society, if they ever come back into society, they're used to a specific way of living. They're used to getting up at like 4 in the morning and, you know, being institutionalized. So in order to break that cycle, like you have to break down the system that was created in order to break people down and actually have something that's going to rehabilitate people, something that's going to actually make people really good members of society, folks who give back to, you know, the communities. So, yeah.
Just one more, I'm sorry, just one more thing. Sorry, I'll leave you one second. Also, like, one of the things I was talking about earlier is how gender is policed, and how trans lives, low income, the lives of low income people of color generally are heavily policed. So we really need to look at what is being criminalized. Why are people being locked up? Because I started with saying, talking about the woman who's reacting to violence that a family member of hers experienced. But again, a lot of people are in prison for non-violent crimes. So we have to look at, do we really think sex work should be a crime? Is it something that should just be regulated so that people who are engaging in it feel safer and can do it in a way that protects them? Same thing with drug offenses. So it's really, again, like taking a deeper look at what people are in prison for, what we are criminalizing, and asking if those crimes are really things that we as a society think people should be tossed into prison for. So decriminalization and a deeper analysis around that is one way to find that solution.
I wanted to just say, I wanted to, I'm so grateful that you all are here. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about, I think for social workers, I definitely hear a lot, and people not having a clear understanding of why people, particularly trans women, engage in sex work, and not having a clear understanding that it's directly connected to jobs, and the lack of jobs, and discrimination. And just wanted to add that it's an international phenomenon. It's not somehow a deficit in that particular person or client. It's that exactly what June raised was that we live in a society that doesn't allow, you know, the way that trans people are seen in society, that they're not welcome, not allowed, not able to be part of society, so they don't have access to jobs or access to school. You know, I can go on and on and on. So the point of that is, could you talk a little bit more about, like, so exactly some of the offenses that people are being put in jail for, how sex work is looked at, and particularly with trans women, and how people are being extra criminalized just for being trans.
Like with China Glass, with the example that Alicia had given before, with the well then, with the prison, with the PAC member, China Glass, and she had spoken about how when she was a boy, and she was, you know, well, male body, and people perceived her as being male and a boy. And she was actually engaging in sex work at the time. She walked past like millions of police officers, and nobody said anything to her. As soon as her gender expression and gender identity came into question, as soon as people started seeing that, oh, you know, there's like something really effeminate about this person. Like, is that a boy? Is it a girl? Like, you know, as soon as she was able to be perceived as being trans, then it became an issue. Then it was like, okay, like her, even though she was engaging in sex work at both times, like it was then, oh, like she has to be a prostitute now. Like now, like, you know, she's dressed this way. She's, you know, she's putting herself out in what I think is a sexual manner. Like that must be what she's doing. And, you know, I think it goes back to women being thought of as sexual objects. Like it's an issue of misogyny. It's an issue of, you know, gender expression and how people aren't gay bashed for perceived sexual orientation. People are gay bashed because of gender expression. Exactly. If somebody's effeminate, exactly, and then they're gonna get the snot beat out of them because they are feminine. It's not, oh, you sleep with other men. No, like you don't know who that person sleeps with. But because they have a limp wrist and because they're expressing like, you know, some kind of effeminate nature, that's what promotes violence. That's why people want to like, you know, choke people up, because it goes back to misogyny. It goes back to, you know, people not really allowing trans women or people who are wanting to identify as a woman to be that woman and to, you know, be powerful in that. You know, sex work is highly criminalized, like, you know, solicitation, and like there are so many trans women who are arrested and patted down and stopped by police officers, you know, stop and frisk, for waiting for people. With like, there was an issue in New York State, and I'm sure Alicia can attest to this, where if like trans women had like a certain amount of condoms in their pocketbooks, that they would get arrested. It's like, really, like, you know, there are people out there who are actually engaging in outreach to other trans women who are sex workers. So if they have condoms in their purse, guess what, genius? Like, they're doing that in order to help other trans women. Like, they're not actually engaging in sex work themselves. So like, these service providers are the ones who are being arrested. These service providers are the ones who are being stopped and frisked and harassed by police officers who are enforcing the prison industrial complex. They're not there to serve and protect, as so many people think that they are. They're not about CPR, honey. They are about, like, they're not. It's not courtesy, professionalism, and respect at all. Like, it's about harassment and degradation and, like, just shame. So, yeah. Thank you. I hope that answered the question.
My name is Matt, and I'm thinking about how we have a culture that might view sex work as pejorative, yet sort of tolerate rape.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can speak about that. Any which way that you can connect sort of threats made to victims who suffer from who are raped or maybe blamed and such, yet sex work is criminalized. So it's sort of like paying for service. The sex worker is maybe thought of as the criminal, yet generally males who would rape a woman or a male are taking something from that person and violating them in that way. So I'm not sure if I really have a question or if I'm just making a comment, but that's just, while we're sitting here talking about this, that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
I think you made a really good point that I was, you know, trying to second and shake my head. I don't know how much more I have to add to that, except for, I do think, again, people just need to take the time to have these sort of discussions, like deeper analysis around these things. Because it's quick, people are really quick to just be like, oh, it's the woman who's engaging in sex work who, you know, she's the one that we need to work on. She either needs to go to prison or enter one of these alternatives to prisons, and they don't really think about the person who is soliciting that person, soliciting those services. And it's something that has served, it's proven to be a detriment to our clients, the trans women who are engaging in sex work and other ones who are not, who are just walking down the street. And people don't really think about the history. I don't know, a lot of people don't talk about or don't learn about the riots in Harlem back in the 1900s, early 1900s. But there was the same thing going on back then, where black women were just seen as these over-sexualized, being like, watch your men around black women. And it was happening a lot back then, to where black women who were standing on the street were being arrested for engaging in sex work. And what set off the riots was this woman a black woman who was standing on the corner waiting for her boyfriend. And a police officer, plainclothes police officer, just came over and was harassing her, trying to solicit sex, and she was just like, well, I'm not offering you anything. And then her boyfriend came up and they got into an altercation, and then the riot started. But anyway, I just feel like if people were to think about those things, like take like a real deep historical perspective, and see who is being criminalized, who is being over-sexualized, I think we would possibly already have the solution. We would already have sex work being regulated and protections in place. But we aren't having those deeper discussions.
I was wondering about the overlap between groups that I've seen that are trying to decriminalize sex workers, and then it's a very different issue than, you know, the trafficking victims. And then you have the other side where you have a group of people like transgender people who aren't really allowed into the legal economy and who are left with little choices and end up in that work. So I'm wondering how do you guys work at all with those other segments, because each one is very different from the other. Like, for example, the people who are trying to decriminalize it, I saw one woman and she wanted to be a sex worker, she had other choices, so I felt like, okay, I can be okay with that. But then if someone doesn't have those choices and they're forced into that, I'm just wondering how those two different rights movement kind of coexist together. And is there ever disagreement between the two groups about that, and how do you mitigate that?
One of the groups in New York City that you should probably look into is the Sex Workers Project, which we work very closely with. They do a great job of, they do trainings like we do, Trans 101, trans awareness trainings. They also do, I don't know if they call it sex worker awareness trainings, but that's what I'm going to refer to it as. But in their trainings, they help service providers identify the distinction, like see who is engaging in sex work because they want to, and we want sex work decriminalized, and also like who has been pushed into it, who has been trafficked into the system. So we do work with groups like Sex Workers Project who sees the distinction, and we make sure that we are trained on that ourselves. Yeah, I have 5 minutes left.
Sure. Yeah. I was just wondering, I know a little bit of safe harbor legislation a few years back. I think that was the title of it, but with criminalizing young people who are involved in sex work and kind of taking them out of the criminal system. I wonder if that's had an impact on younger, transgender youth who maybe are engaging in sex work. Have you seen any kind of impact of that?
There has been some impact, but the safe harbor legislation was actually pretty limited, and it was something that it's one of those many things that we kind of mix feelings about, because again, it was targeting like a very specific group and it wasn't addressing the broader problem. So it did have a minor impact, but it's not really the sort of solution that we were looking for.
I had a kind of spinning a little bit off of what he had said that kind of jumped into my head is, and I don't know if I'll be able to phrase the question correctly, but the idea that maybe there's this assumption with transgender, specifically trans women, that they're sex workers, but also maybe that they can't be raped, like the idea that their potential victimization isn't taken seriously by law enforcement. Is there, I don't know if I'm phrasing that right, where there's an assumption that they're sex workers and therefore are seen as sexual beings in that sense. But then maybe that if they are victimized or are raped and are trying to report that to law enforcement, then it's not taken as seriously because they're a trans woman compared to like a cisgender woman.
I mean, I think that that's definitely an interesting,
It's more like a question
Yeah.
of that exists,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also, do you see a relationship between that, or does it seem completely hypocritical the way that I'm phrasing it as well?
I think, like, especially like with Alicia and SRLP, like what, like, because I remember when I was with the PAC, and I would like deal with a lot of the incarcerated individuals, and I would write letters to them, like frequently. And you're talking about like the incarcerated individuals, correct?
And even every day,
In
but
general.
yes,
General.
incarcerated as well, that they're sex workers, but then they can perhaps be physically attacked, but not raped per se, because, or it's that it's looked at differently compared to a cisgender woman.
Whenever trans people would be attacked or raped or violated in any kind of way, it would occur from like POs, from COs, like folks who were in power, folks who actually were the people who were there to protect trans women. So, you know, for them to like then say, oh yeah, like, you know, I did that, like it kind of not be realistic that they would do that. They would step up to the plate and admit to doing those things. Like, you know, they did it as a way. Rape, of course, is like a show of power. It's not necessarily sexual. It's not, you know, because someone, it's just a show of folks showing that, oh yeah, I can do this, I can take this from you when I want to. So, you know, like it's oftentimes folks who feel like they're in power and entitled to do this, they do it. And I mean, there's no, I don't know. We got the 1 minute time.
I was basically just acknowledging and shaking my head because it's something I was touching on earlier as far as if people are incarcerated, they don't want to report what happened to them, or when they do report it because it was someone else who was incarcerated or a correctional officer, it's usually just like they're not believed. They're seen as the person who initiated the
Right, that's exactly right.
And the same thing that happens on the outside, which is why we need to find solutions to prisons and to police officers. Smaller solutions in our own communities because people don't want to call the police because they know they're not going to be believed. It's the same thing for again the low income communities, undocumented communities. Like no one wants to bring the police in because once these different identities are brought up, whether it's their immigration status or their gender identity, they're usually the ones that are going to be blamed. And just brings on more violence in the community and takes them away from their families. So just, yes, that does happen, what you were saying. And it's something that we struggle with, trying to make sure that we meet people's survival needs with our legal work, but also meet their survival needs by bringing them into a community, into our membership structure, so that when they do run into violence or whatever, that they have communities that they can go to, and they don't feel like they need to resort to the police or to any other member of the prison industrial complex that usually just ends up incarcerated.
I just want to piggyback on what she said, because I think something that I think that you're raising that's really important is also the concept of deviance. That you can't be raped because somehow you're a sexual deviant. Mm-hmm. You enjoy being sexually deviant.
That's what I mean.
And I want to just be a social worker for 2 seconds. The concept and the understanding is that for LGBT people in general, well, you must have been sexually assaulted sometime in your childhood. And I always say, well, if that's statistically true, that's how gay people are made, then there would be so many more gay people in this world, given the statistics. But there's a pathology that the understanding that gay men, trans women, you know, can't be raped. Because somehow this is, oh, you're going to prison, that's going to be, they make jokes about it. That it's going to be this wonderful experience probably, because for a gay man to be incarcerated, or trans women to be incarcerated, because they'll be surrounded by the men they love. Isn't this some sexual fantasy for people? So I really appreciate what you're saying, because I do think, and I hear it in this program, that there is still that understanding somehow that people are not experiencing sexual violence based on their gender identity or their sexuality. Thank you for that.
Yeah, definitely as service providers, I don't know if everyone students or practitioners, but as service providers, future service providers, just make sure that you are coming to these sorts of panels, getting involved with different groups and hearing people's stories so that it's harder for you to see people as sexualized beings. You may not even recognize, again, because of the way that we have our media, our religious beliefs, and a lot of other messages being pushed at us in society. You may not even realize that you were seeing people as these sexual beings or something that they are not. I mean, I take it everyone in this room has good intentions, but we all have bias that we need to correct, and it's only going to be done by going out and hearing people's stories and kind of challenging those beliefs.
And it's like you have to be consistent at it. Like it's not going to happen overnight. And like I said before with the trifecta, like it happens, it can be subliminal. Like it's not something that you may necessarily like have at the forefront of your mind, thinking that, oh yeah, you know, like I've been, this has affected me in such and such a way. Like no, you're not necessarily going to know that. And just be as cognizant as possible that you have to work on these in order to be the best service provider that you can be for folks who really, really need you.
Now we're going to have the last but not least panel on macro change within the systems, hosted by social workers on public policy. It's going to take about 5 minutes to change that. So thank you so much.
One last thing, I'm sorry. For those of you who want to hear more about prison conditions for people who are transgender, non-conforming, and intersex in prison, you should go to SRLP's website and download our report. It's War in here. It is really, really good, and it's a great way, again, to really hear those stories and challenge